Before I begin, if you've ever lived through fear, judgment, or a moment where one small decision changed everything, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. I didn't recognize him at first. That's the strange thing about power. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly in a tailored suit, eyes hidden behind stillness, holding a baby who won't stop crying. I was seated 3 rows back on that overnight flight, knees pressed against the seat in front of me, my carry-on stuffed under my feet, my own son asleep against my shoulder. We were flying economy because that's what you do when you count every dollar and still choose to travel because staying would cost you more. The crying started before takeoff, sharp, desperate, the kind of cry that doesn't pause for breath. At first, people did what people always do. They shifted, sighed, glanced around with irritation disguised as sympathy. A flight attendant offered warm water, then a bottle. The baby screamed louder. The man holding him didn't move much. He rocked stiffly, like someone imitating what he'd seen rather than what he felt. His jaw was tight, eyes fixed forward as if daring the universe to challenge him further. I felt it in my chest before I thought it through, that familiar pull, the ache that comes when you recognize a cry because you've lived it. My son, Mateo, had cried like that when he was an infant, not hungry, not tired, just overwhelmed by the world. I had learned the hard way that sometimes babies don't need fixing, they need surrender. I stood up before fear could talk me out of it. A few heads turned. The man looked at me then, really looked, and something in his gaze made my stomach drop. Not anger, not curiosity, assessment. Cold, practiced, immediate, the kind of look that decides things. "I'm sorry," I said softly, already halfway regretting it. "May I try something?" He didn't answer right away. The baby's face was red now, fists clenched, lungs burning. Finally, the man nodded once, no words, just permission. I reached out slowly, palms open so he could see I meant no harm. When I took the baby, he didn't resist. He melted into me like he'd been waiting. I shifted my weight, pressed his ear against my chest, and hummed. Not a song, just sound, the same low vibration I'd used 100 times before. My son stirred, but didn't wake. It took less than 30 seconds. The crying stopped so abruptly the cabin seemed to inhale. People froze, as if sudden silence might shatter if acknowledged. I kept rocking, eyes closed, breathing deep and slow. The baby sighed, actually sighed. I felt it through my bones. When I looked up, the man was staring at me like I'd pulled a weapon instead of peace. His face didn't soften, but something in his posture shifted. He leaned closer, voice low. "What did you do?" I listened. Babies can tell when you're afraid. He absorbed that without comment. When I handed the baby back, carefully, he cradled him differently, less rigid. The baby slept. I returned to my seat, heart pounding, palms damp. That should have been the end of it. A strange moment on a long flight, something to tell a friend later, maybe laugh about. But halfway through the flight, a flight attendant touched my arm and asked me to follow her. Fear has a smell. It's metallic, like blood and cold air. I smelled it as I stood, kissed my son's forehead, and walked down the aisle past sleeping passengers. The man stood near the galley, baby still asleep, 2 other men flanking him. They didn't look like security, they looked like inevitability. He introduced himself with a name that meant nothing to me then and everything later. His voice was calm, polite even. "You didn't ask who I was," he said. "I didn't need to. Your baby was crying." A pause, long, dangerous. He said, "My son hasn't slept in 3 days. No one can calm him. Not doctors, not nurses, not his mother." Something cracked in his voice when he said that last word. Not weakness, grief. "I'm a single mom," I said, surprising myself. Sometimes we do better when we stop trying to control the moment. He studied me again, slower this time. Then he nodded toward my seat. "Sit with us, please." That was the first time I realized this wasn't a request. I sat. We talked quietly while the baby slept. He asked about my son, about where I was going. I answered carefully, truthfully, without volunteering more than needed. He told me nothing about himself, but I felt the weight of what he didn't say. When we landed, he thanked me, pressed a card in my hand. No title, no number I recognized, just a name embossed in silver. "Call if you ever need anything." I laughed because the idea was absurd. Then I saw his eyes. He wasn't joking. I didn't call him that day, or the next, but life has a way of pushing you toward doors you never meant to open. And when I finally did dial that number, months later, it wasn't for myself. It was because of my son. I kept that card tucked into the zipper pocket of my purse like it might burn me if I looked at it too long. Every time I cleaned out old receipts or searched for loose change, my fingers would brush against the thick paper and I'd feel that same jolt of disbelief all over again. A name in silver. No phone number I recognized, no explanation, just a door I didn't plan to open. Life went back to being life. School drop-offs, long shifts, counting groceries at the checkout and silently subtracting items until the total matched what I had in my account. Mateo was older now, 7, and curious about everything, asking questions I didn't always know how to answer. Why some kids had dads at every school event, why some moms never looked tired, why I sometimes stared out the window like I was listening for something only I could hear. I told myself the plane was just a strange moment, a story without a sequel. Then Mateo got sick. It started with a fever that wouldn't break. I stayed up 2 nights straight, cool cloth on his forehead, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. By the 3rd day, his breathing sounded wrong, shallow, fast. I took him to the clinic because that's what I could afford. They listened, frowned, and told me I needed to get him to a hospital, a real one. I remember standing in the parking lot with my phone in my hand, Mateo leaning heavily against my leg, and feeling that old familiar panic claw its way up my throat. I had insurance, technically, the kind that covers just enough to make you think you're safe until you actually need it. I knew what a hospital stay could do to someone like me. One night could undo years of careful balancing. That's when I felt the card. I sat in the car for a long time before I called. I rehearsed what I would say, erased it, tried again. I wasn't asking for money, I told myself. I was asking for advice, or maybe a favor, or maybe just a reminder that the world wasn't as hard as it felt in that moment. The phone rang once, twice. He answered. He didn't sound surprised. That scared me more than if he had. "My son is sick," I said, the words tumbling out before pride could stop them. "I don't know who else to call." "Where are you?" he asked. I told him. "Stay there," he said. "Help is coming." I wanted to protest, to explain, to say I didn't mean like that, but the line went dead. Help came in less than 15 minutes. Not an ambulance with sirens blaring, but a black SUV that pulled up like it belonged there. A man stepped out, calm, professional, already on the phone as he approached. He spoke to me like I mattered, like my fear was valid. Mateo was transferred, admitted, treated. Pneumonia, they said, caught just in time. I stayed by his bed that night, watching the rise and fall of his chest, listening to the steady beep of machines I didn't understand. I thought about the plane, about a crying baby, about how close I'd come to letting fear keep me seated. He came the next morning, no entourage, no dramatic entrance, just him standing in the doorway like he wasn't sure if he was welcome. Mateo was asleep again, color slowly returning to his cheeks. "You did this," I said quietly. "I made a call. You did the rest." We talked in low voices. He asked questions, real ones, about Mateo's birth, about his father, about me. I answered more freely than I'd expected. There was something about him that made honesty feel less dangerous, maybe because I knew he already held power over my life and wasn't abusing it. "I owe you," he said at one point. "No," I said immediately, "you don't." He studied me, then nodded. "Good," he said. "Neither do you." That was the moment I understood something important. This wasn't charity. It wasn't a transaction. It was an exchange of humanity, and that made it harder to define and easier to trust. After Mateo was discharged, the bills came. Of course they did. I didn't open them at first. I stacked them neatly on the counter, like if I pretended they were just paper, they couldn't hurt me. One evening, as I was cooking rice and beans, my phone buzzed. "They're taken care of," he said before I could speak. I sank into a chair, tears blurring my vision. "I didn't ask you to—" "I know," he interrupted gently. "That's why I did." From that point on, our lives became loosely, carefully connected. Not friends, not family, something quieter. He never showed up unannounced, never offered more than I could accept. He asked permission for everything. Even when he helped, it felt like he was protecting something fragile between us. I learned who he was from the news before I ever heard it from him. Headlines, words like boss, empire, feared. I stared at the screen, remembering the way his baby slept against my chest, trusting without knowing why. The contrast made my hand shake. When I finally asked him about it, he didn't deny it. "My world is not a safe one," he said simply. "That's why that night mattered so much to me. You weren't afraid of me. You were afraid for my son." That scared me more than any headline. I worried about what being connected to him might mean for Mateo, for me. I considered pulling away, changing numbers, disappearing back into anonymity. But every time I thought about it, I remembered the look on his face when the crying stopped, the relief, the gratitude. He wasn't asking to own my life. He was asking to be human in it. Still, I knew there would be a cost. There always is when power enters the room. I just didn't know yet what form it would take or how deeply it would test the kind of mother and woman I believed myself to be. The next time I saw him wasn't in a hospital or on a plane. It was at my door. I opened the door with a dish towel still in my hand, the smell of onions and garlic hanging in the air. For half a second, I thought my exhaustion was playing tricks on me. He didn't belong in the narrow hallway of my apartment building, under the flickering light and peeling paint. He looked like a story that had wandered into the wrong book. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have called first." My heart hammered, but not from fear, from the collision of worlds. "It's okay," I managed. "Mateo's doing homework." He nodded, eyes scanning the hallway like he was memorizing it, cataloging exits, threats, details. Then he stepped inside, careful not to brush against anything, like he understood how small this space was to me. I closed the door behind him and suddenly felt exposed, like I'd invited a storm into my living room. Mateo peeked around the corner, pencil still in hand. He froze when he saw a stranger, then relaxed when he saw my face. "Hi," he said politely. "Hi," the man replied, lowering himself slightly to Mateo's level. "You feeling better?" Mateo nodded. "Mom makes good soup." Something like a smile crossed the man's face, not the kind meant for the world, the kind that slips out when you forget you're being watched. We sat at the table. I poured him water in a chipped glass. He didn't comment. He asked about Mateo's school, his favorite subject, whether you liked airplanes. Mateo answered freely, proud, unaware of the weight of the man across from him. I watched closely, ready to intervene, but nothing felt wrong. If anything, it felt gentle. When Mateo went back to his room, the air shifted. "I didn't come to intrude," he said. I came to thank you properly. You already did, I replied. He shook his head. You changed something for me that night. I've spent my life surrounded by people who obey me, who fear me. You didn't. You saw a baby and you acted. I didn't know what to say to that. Praise makes me uncomfortable, especially when it's wrapped in danger. I won't pretend my world is clean. I won't lie to you, but I will promise this: nothing I bring to your door will ever touch your son. The words landed heavy. A promise from a man like him wasn't reassurance, it was a vow. I didn't ask to be part of your world, I said carefully. I know. That's why I'm asking now. I should have said no. Every instinct told me to close the door, to thank him and send him away. But there was something in his eyes then. Not hunger, not control. Fear, the kind men like him never admit to. My son's mother is gone. Not dead, just gone. She couldn't live with what my life required. I don't blame her. But my son cries when strangers hold him. He doesn't trust easily, except that night, except you. I swallowed. I'm not a replacement. I'm not asking you to be. I'm asking you to teach me what you know. That was the moment I understood the unthinkable thing I'd already done. I hadn't just calmed a baby, I'd cracked open something sealed tight by power and fear, and now it was looking to me for shape. We set boundaries, clear ones. He would visit rarely, never alone with Mateo, never bring his work, his people, his shadows into our home. In return, I would show him what I knew: how to listen to a cry, how to hold without tension, how to let go of control long enough to let trust in. It wasn't easy. The first time his son cried in my living room, his hands shook. He hovered, anxious, watching me for cues. I guided him gently, placing his arm differently, slowing his breath with mine. When the baby settled, tears slid down his face without warning. I rule empires, he whispered, and I can't calm my own child. I touched his arm before thinking. Strength isn't domination, it's presence. From then on, something changed between us. Not romance, not dependency, respect. We talked about things that had nothing to do with his world: books, music, the strange weight of responsibility. He never raised his voice in my home, never took a call inside. When he laughed, it surprised him. The rumors started anyway. They always do. A neighbor asked too many questions. A man lingered too long outside one evening. I confronted him immediately. You promised, I said, fear sharp in my throat, and I will keep it. The next day the man was gone. No drama, no explanation, just absence. That scared me more than any confrontation would have. I considered ending it then, cutting ties completely, but Mateo had grown attached to the baby. He called him little brother without understanding what that meant, and the baby, his name was Luca, reached for me the moment I entered a room. You don't rip that away without cause. I told myself I could manage this, that I was in control. I was wrong. Because the day came when his world and mine collided in a way no boundary could prevent. A mistake, a betrayal, a moment that would force me to choose between safety and integrity, between walking away and standing my ground. And that choice would define everything that came after. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly, the way danger often does. It wasn't a threat or a warning. It was a question. Mateo asked me one evening why a man had been sitting in a car across the street for 2 days. He said it casually, like he was asking about the weather. My hand froze over the sink. I looked out the window and saw the car, dark, ordinary, parked just far enough away to pretend it belonged there. I called him that night. I thought we were careful, I said, keeping my voice steady because Mateo was in the next room. We were, he replied, but careful doesn't mean invisible. He came over an hour later, not alone this time. He stood by the window for a long moment, face unreadable, then made a call. He spoke in a language I didn't understand, his tone flat, precise. When he hung up, he turned to me. "You and Mateo will stay somewhere else for a few days," he said. "No," I replied immediately. "We don't run." His jaw tightened. "This isn't about pride. It's about my son," I said. "You promised." "I promised nothing would touch him," he said softly, "and it won't. But that promise requires you to trust me." Trust. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. I had trusted him with my home, my child's presence, my sense of safety, and now I was being asked to leave it behind, even temporarily, because of a life I never chose. "I'll stay," I said. "If there's danger, I want to see it." He looked at me then with something like respect sharpened by frustration. "You don't understand what you're standing in." "Then explain it to me," I said. "Don't manage me. Talk to me." That was the first time he told me the truth without filters, about rivalries that didn't end with apologies, about debts that couldn't be forgiven, about how kindness was often seen as weakness in his world, and how my presence in his life had already been noticed, questioned, resented. "They'll think you're leverage," he said, "or worse, a liability I've gone soft for." "And what do you think?" I asked. He hesitated, just for a second. "I think you remind me of the man I might have been." That scared me more than the car outside ever could. The next morning, the car was gone. So was the neighbor who'd been asking questions. Again, no drama, just absence. But I felt the cost of it settle into my bones. I realized then that every solution he offered came from a world where problems disappeared rather than healed. I told him I needed space, real space, no visits, no calls unless it was about the children. He agreed without argument, which told me he understood more than he let on. Weeks passed, life steadied again, but something had shifted inside me. I watched Mateo more closely. I jumped at unfamiliar sounds. I questioned my own judgment. Had I been reckless? Had my compassion crossed into naivety? One afternoon, Mateo came home quiet, too quiet. He went straight to his room and closed the door. When I asked what was wrong, he said a boy at school had told his mom hung out with bad men. My heart broke in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with guilt. That night I called him. "This ends," I said before he could speak. "Whatever this is, it ends now." He listened. He didn't interrupt. When he finished, there was a long silence on the line. "You're right," he said finally, "and I'm sorry." I hadn't expected that, not from a man like him. He continued, "I never meant for my life to touch yours this way. I wanted to protect something pure by keeping it close, but I see now that distance is the only protection that matters." We agreed on terms, clean ones. No more visits, no more shared space. The children would not be separated abruptly, but the transition would be gentle. He would arrange for Luca's care elsewhere, somewhere safer, somewhere far from my orbit. The last time I saw Luca, he was asleep in my arms, heavier than the first time I'd held him on that plane. I kissed his forehead and whispered a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. "I hope you grow up kind. I hope you never learn to be afraid of love." He stood in the doorway, watching, eyes wet, face carved from regret. "You saved us," he said quietly, "even if you never see it." After he left, the apartment felt smaller, quieter. Mateo asked where the baby had gone. I told him the truth in the simplest way I could, that sometimes people come into our lives to teach us something, and sometimes loving them means letting them go. Months passed, then a year. The headlines changed. His name appeared less often than not at all. I heard through a mutual contact that he'd stepped back, reshaped his empire, moved operations away from anything that could touch his son. I didn't know if that was true. I didn't need to. What I did know was this. One unthinkable act, standing up on a plane, holding a stranger's child, set off a chain of choices that tested every value I held. Compassion, courage, boundaries, love. I learned that doing the right thing doesn't always feel safe, and that walking away can be braver than staying. Years later, Matteo barely remembers Luca, but he remembers the lesson. He tells people his mom once helped a crying baby on a plane, and that changed how he sees the world. He doesn't know all the details. He doesn't need to. Some stories aren't meant to be fully told. They're meant to be lived, then carried quietly, like a scar you don't show but always honor. And sometimes the unthinkable thing you do doesn't save you from danger. It teaches you how to face it without losing yourself. After he left our lives, the silence felt heavier than the fear ever had. It wasn't the kind of quiet that rests. It was the kind that listens. Every sound in the apartment seemed louder. The hum of the refrigerator, the pipes knocking at night, Matteo's footsteps pacing when he couldn't sleep. I told myself this was the price of choosing safety. I told myself it was worth it. But endings don't always end cleanly. Sometimes they echo. Matteo started having nightmares. He didn't scream. He just woke up crying, confused, asking why people had to leave when they promised not to. I held him close and chose my words carefully, because children remember tone more than truth. Some people leave to protect the ones they love, I said, even when it hurts. He nodded, but I knew he didn't fully believe me yet. Trust takes time when it's been bent, even gently. I threw myself into routine, work, school, meals cooked from scratch because control over small things makes chaos feel manageable. I stopped checking the news. I avoided places where men in suits gathered. I convinced myself that chapter was closed. Then one afternoon, a woman knocked on my door. She was younger than I expected, elegant, tired, eyes sharp with grief. She introduced herself as Luca's mother. "I know who you are," she said before I could speak, "and I need to talk to you." My instinct screamed no. Every wall I'd built went on alert. But something in her voice, steady, resigned, made me step aside. She sat at my table, hands folded tightly, and told me her story. How she loved him once, how she tried to survive his world and failed, how she left not because she didn't love her son, but because she was afraid of what staying would turn her into. "She talks about you," she said quietly. "He says you showed him how to hold our child without fear." I felt my throat tighten. "I know, that's why I'm here." She wasn't angry, she wasn't jealous, she was grateful, and that made everything harder. "I'm trying to come back into Luca's life," she said, "but I need to know something first. Did you ever feel afraid of him?" I thought of the car outside, the disappearances, the power. Then I thought of a man crying over his sleeping child. "Yes," I said honestly, "and no." She smiled sadly. "That's who he is." When she left, she hugged me, a real hug, the kind women give each other when they recognize shared survival. That night, I slept without listening for footsteps. Years passed more gently after that. Matteo grew. I grew with him. The sharp edges dulled into lessons. I never saw him again, not in person, not on a plane. But sometimes when I hear a baby cry in public, I feel that familiar pull in my chest. I don't always act on it, but I always listen. Because once, in a narrow cabin high above the ground, I learned that compassion doesn't ask permission, it simply shows up. And sometimes that's enough to change the course of lives you were never meant to keep, only to touch briefly and let go. Life has a way of testing whether the lessons you learned actually stayed with you, or if they were just words you repeated to survive a hard season. For a long time, I thought that chapter of my life was sealed away, filed neatly under things that happened once and would never return. I was wrong, not because he came back, but because the consequences of that moment followed me in quieter, subtler ways. Mateo entered his teenage years with a seriousness that worried me. He was kind, observant, deeply sensitive to other people's moods. Teachers praised his empathy, friends confided in him, but sometimes, late at night, he would ask questions that felt far older than his age. "Mom," he asked once, staring at the ceiling, "do you think people are born good, or do they just learn how to hide the bad?" I knew exactly where that question came from, even if he didn't. "I think people are complicated," I said, "and most of them are trying not to lose the parts of themselves they're proud of." He was quiet for a long time after that. As he grew, so did my awareness of how much children absorb without being told. Mateo remembered the baby on the plane, not the danger, not the fear, but the choice. He remembered me standing up when everyone else stayed seated. He told that story in school once, framed not as something heroic, but as something normal. "That's just what my mom does," he'd said. Those words stayed with me more than any compliment ever could. Years later, when Mateo was nearly grown, I received a letter. Not a call, not a visit, a letter, handwritten, delivered without a return address. I recognized the handwriting immediately. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He simply told me Luca was doing well, that he laughed easily now, that he slept through the night, that he trusted his parents in a way that once seemed impossible. He said stepping back from the darkest parts of his world hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. Not redemption, he was careful with that word, but restraint. "You showed me there was something worth protecting more than power, and that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is walk away from what he built." I folded the letter and placed it in a box I kept hidden, not out of shame, but out of reverence. Some things aren't meant to be displayed. They're meant to be remembered quietly. Mateo never read that letter. He didn't need to. He was already living its message. One evening, years later, we were on a bus together when a baby started crying uncontrollably. The mother looked exhausted, embarrassed, shrinking under the weight of impatient stares. Before I could move, Mateo stood up. "May I help you?" he asked her gently. He didn't touch the baby, he didn't offer advice, he just spoke softly, distractingly, giving her a moment to breathe. The baby calmed, the mother smiled through tears. Mateo sat back down like nothing extraordinary had happened. That's when I knew. The unthinkable thing I'd done on that plane hadn't just altered a moment, it had shaped a legacy. Not one built on fear or power, but on courage that looks like kindness and strength that sounds like calm. I never saw Luca again. I don't need to. I see echoes of him every time someone chooses compassion in a room full of indifference. And I see him most clearly in my son. Some stories don't end with closure. They end with continuation, passed quietly from one life to another, carried forward in choices that seem small until you realize how much they matter. Time has a way of smoothing the sharpest edges, but it never erases the shape of what happened. As Mateo grew older and stepped into his own life, I began to understand that my role was changing. I was no longer the shield standing in front of him. I was becoming the quiet place behind him, the one he could return to when the world felt too heavy. He left for college with a hug that lingered longer than either of us expected. I stood in the doorway of our small apartment, the same one I'd moved into years earlier when survival was my only plan, and watched him walk away carrying confidence I hadn't known how to give him back then, yet somehow he had it. Alone again, I had more time to think. about the woman I had been on that plane, about the fear that had sat in my chest like a living thing, about the way a crying baby had cut through layers of danger and reminded everyone present of something simple and ancient: need, vulnerability, life. People sometimes ask me, when they hear parts of the story softened and simplified, if I was scared. I always tell them the truth. I was terrified. Courage didn't arrive like a wave. It came as a whisper that said, "You can't live with yourself if you don't try." That whisper has followed me my entire life. I began volunteering at a women's shelter a few nights a week, not because I thought I had answers, but because I knew what it felt like to be unseen. I sat with mothers who hadn't slept. I held babies while paperwork was filled out. I listened more than I spoke. Sometimes when a baby cried and nothing seemed to help, I'd feel that old stillness return, the one I'd felt at 30,000 feet in the air. I'd hum softly, not to the child, but to myself, a reminder that panic doesn't soothe anyone, presence does. One night, a young woman asked me why I kept coming back. I thought about it for a long moment before answering. "Because someone once trusted me when they didn't have to," I said, "and it changed more than one life." She didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. Years passed, my hair began to gray, my hands bore the quiet marks of work and time. Life was not glamorous, but it was full. Mateo called often, sometimes to ask advice, sometimes just to hear my voice. One afternoon, I received a package in the mail, no return address. Inside was a small wooden music box, hand-carved, simple, and elegant. When I opened it, a familiar melody played, the same lullaby I'd hummed on that plane. There was no note. I sat at my kitchen table and let the music play until it stopped on its own. I didn't cry, I smiled. Some connections don't require words, they just require acknowledgement. I placed the music box on a shelf beside a framed photo of Mateo as a child, his smile wide and unafraid. Two reminders of the same truth, separated by years but bound by intention. As I grew older, I learned that the unthinkable isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's choosing softness in a hard place. Sometimes it's believing that your presence matters even when you feel small. That plane landed long ago. The world moved on. But I carry that moment with me, not as a burden, but as a compass. When I lie awake at night now, listening to the city breathe outside my window, I think about all the choices we make without knowing who they will become inside someone else. I think about how fear shrinks us and how love, real love, asks us to expand. If there is a lesson in my story, it's this: you don't have to be powerful to change the course of things. You just have to be willing. Willing to stand up, willing to soothe, willing to see another human being not as a threat, but as a life worth protecting. That willingness shaped my son. It shaped a man I'll never truly know, and it shaped me. And in the quiet after the crying stops, that's enough. Life didn't end with some grand curtain call. It kept moving the way it always does, forward and indifferent, yet strangely kind in the smallest details. After the music box arrived, I found myself thinking less about what had happened on that plane and more about what had grown out of it. Not the danger, not the tension, but the ripple. One moment of human instinct echoing through years I never could have planned. I retired from my job at the clinic when my knees started complaining louder than my conscience. The goodbye party was modest: store-bought cake, paper plates, hugs that lingered too long. They thanked me for my patience, my steadiness. None of them knew how much of that steadiness had been forged in one long night above the clouds. With more free time, I started writing, not for publication, just for myself. I filled notebooks with memories I didn't want to lose, the smell of airplane coffee, the weight of an unfamiliar baby in my arms, the way fear sounds when it tries to disguise itself as authority. Writing became another way of holding things gently. Mateo visited when he could. He had his own life now, his own responsibilities, but he never came empty-handed. Sometimes groceries, sometimes laughter, sometimes silence we shared comfortably, proof that love doesn't always need conversation. One evening, as we washed dishes side by side, he asked me a question I hadn't expected. "Mom," he said carefully, "were you ever angry about how hard things were when I was little?" I dried my hands slowly before answering. "I was tired," I said. "I was scared. But angry? No. You were never the reason life was hard. You were the reason it was bearable." He nodded, eyes focused on the sink, absorbing something he didn't know he needed. I realized then that we spend so much time worrying about the scars we give our children, we forget the strength we pass on without noticing. Later that night, after he left, I opened the music box again. The tune filled the room softly, and I thought about the other child, the one whose cries had started everything. Somewhere he was growing too, laughing, learning, unaware of how close his life once brushed against mine. I didn't need to know where he was. Some stories don't require updates. They exist complete, like a circle. As years folded in on themselves, my world grew smaller but deeper. Morning walks, warm tea, familiar faces at the market. I learned to appreciate the slowness, the way time gives back what urgency steals. People often talk about destiny as if it's loud and dramatic, but I think destiny whispers, it nudges, it places you in a seat you didn't choose and asks you what kind of person you're going to be for the next few minutes. On that plane, I answered without thinking. Every day since has been an echo of that answer. If I could speak to the woman I was back then, I wouldn't tell her to be brave. I'd tell her something simpler. You already are, I'd say. You just don't know it yet. And maybe that's the quiet miracle of life. Not that extraordinary things happen, but that ordinary people rise to them when it matters. That's the story I carry now. Not of fear or power, but of presence, of choosing care when the world expects distance, of believing that one small act done sincerely can change the shape of many lives, including your own.
Time softened the sharp edges of memory, but it never erased them. Instead, it polished them into something gentler, something I could hold without flinching. By the time Mateo turned 30, I was no longer the woman scrambling to keep everything together. I had learned the art of enough. Enough money, enough love, enough peace to get through a day without fear pressing on my chest. We celebrated his birthday quietly at my small dining table. A home-cooked meal, candles that burned unevenly, laughter that felt earned. When he hugged me goodbye that night, he held on longer than usual, like he was trying to say something without words. As I watched him walk to his car, I realized how rarely parents get to witness the full shape of their children's becoming. Most of it happens away from us, in private moments we'll never see. After he left, the house felt especially still. I sat in my armchair, the music box resting on my lap, unopened. For the first time, I wondered what had become of the man on the plane, the boss everyone feared, the father who had looked at me with something dangerously close to gratitude. Curiosity flickered, but it didn't burn. I didn't need answers. Wondering was enough. A few weeks later, an unexpected envelope arrived in the mail. No return address, thick paper, heavy. My name typed neatly across the front. For a moment, my pulse quickened, an old reflex I thought I'd outgrown. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single letter and a photograph. The photo showed a young boy, maybe 7 or 8, smiling shyly at the camera, holding the very same music box I now kept on my shelf. The letter was brief, written in careful, formal language. He wrote that his son was healthy, that the crying had been caused by pain no one had recognized at the time. That night on the plane had changed him in ways he never fully admitted aloud. He thanked me, not for calming the baby, but for reminding him that fear and love can exist in the same breath, and that one doesn't have to destroy the other. There was no signature, just a final line. "You gave my son comfort when I couldn't. I hope life has been gentle to you." I read the letter 3 times. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from something closer to relief. Closure, perhaps, the kind that arrives quietly, without fanfare. I placed the photo back in the envelope and tucked it into a drawer with my important papers. Not hidden, just safe. Some connections are meant to be acknowledged, not revisited. That night, I slept deeply, dreamlessly. When morning came, sunlight streamed through the curtains, warm and forgiving. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching neighbors start their day. Ordinary lives brushing past each other, each carrying stories no one else could see. I thought about how easily that night on the plane could have gone differently, how fear could have won, how silence could have replaced action, and how, if it had, none of this, the peace, the letters, the understanding, would exist. We don't always get to choose the moments that define us, but we do choose how we respond to them. As the years continued their gentle march forward, I found myself sharing my story now and then, not for drama, but for reassurance, with young mothers at the clinic, with neighbors feeling overwhelmed, with anyone who needed to hear that being kind doesn't make you weak, and being brave doesn't always look loud. If there was a lesson in my life, it was this: compassion is never wasted, even when it feels small, even when it feels risky, especially then. And if one day, somewhere, that boy grows up and wonders why a music box matters so much to him, I hope he feels what I felt that night in the narrow aisle of an airplane when the world paused just long enough for 2 strangers to choose humanity.
Life has a way of circling back when you least expect it, not to reopen wounds, but to show you how far you've come. After that letter arrived, something in me loosened, not dramatically, just a quiet untying, like a knot you didn't realize you'd been carrying for years, finally giving way. I started volunteering more regularly at the community center near my apartment, mostly with young mothers, women with tired eyes and hands that never seemed to rest. I recognized myself in them, not in the details, but in the weight they carried, the constant calculation of how to stretch love, money, and energy just a little further than seemed possible. Sometimes, when they asked how I managed, I didn't talk about strength. I talked about moments, about showing up even when you're afraid, about how one small decision can ripple outward in ways you'll never fully see. Mateo noticed the change in me before I did. One afternoon, over coffee, he said, "You seem lighter, Mama." He smiled when he said it, but his eyes searched mine, the way children do even when they're grown. I told him about the letter then, not every detail, just enough. He listened without interrupting, his fingers wrapped around his mug. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You always taught me that people are more than the worst things they do," he said. "I guess that night proved it." His words stayed with me. Parenthood is strange that way. You think you're teaching your child how to live, and then one day they reflect your own lessons back to you, polished and clearer than you ever managed to say them. Months passed, seasons changed. I turned 65 with little fanfare and a lot of gratitude. My life wasn't glamorous, it wasn't wealthy, but it was full of routines that grounded me, relationships that mattered, and memories that no longer hurt when I touched them. One evening, after a long day at the center, I found myself standing in line at the grocery store behind a young woman holding a baby who wouldn't stop crying. The sound cut through me instantly, sharp and familiar. I watched her shoulders tense, her face flush with embarrassment as people shifted impatiently around her. Without thinking, I stepped forward. I smiled at the baby, made a soft sound I used to make with Mateo. The crying didn't stop right away, but the woman's eyes met mine, grateful and near tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, as if apologizing for existing. "You don't need to be," I said gently. "You're doing fine." She nodded, biting her lip, and in that moment I understood something deeply. The world doesn't change because of grand gestures. It changes because over and over, ordinary people choose kindness in small, quiet ways. I didn't hold the baby. I didn't need to. Just being there, just acknowledging her struggle was enough. When I got home, I took the music box down from the shelf. I turned the key and listened as the melody filled the room, thin but steady. I thought about how many hands it had passed through, how many moments it had witnessed, comfort moving from one life to another, leaving traces behind. I realized then that the story wasn't really about a mafia boss or a crying baby or even a frightened single mother on a plane. It was about connection, about how for a brief moment two lives intersected and changed course, not through power or fear, but through trust. That night, I wrote Mateo a letter, not because I needed to say anything urgent, but because I wanted to leave words behind that might matter someday. I wrote about that night on the plane in fuller detail than I ever had, about the fear, yes, but also about the choice to act with compassion even when the world warns you not to. I sealed the letter and tucked it away, not to be read now, just to exist. As I lay in bed, listening to the distant sounds of the city, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace, not the absence of pain, but the presence of meaning. The understanding that every life, no matter how small it seems, has the power to touch another. And sometimes, all it takes is the courage to stand up in a narrow airplane aisle and say, "May I try?" There comes a point in life when the future stops feeling like a promise and starts feeling like a gift. I didn't notice when that shift happened for me. It wasn't tied to a birthday or a milestone. It arrived quietly, the way peace often does, slipping in while you're busy living. The community center asked me to help organize a small support circle for older parents and grandparents raising children again. At first, I hesitated. I didn't see myself as someone with wisdom to offer. I had simply survived. But survival, I learned, carries its own kind of knowledge. We met once a week in a sunlit room with mismatched chairs and a coffee pot that never stayed hot long enough. Stories spilled out slowly at first, then faster. Regret, guilt, fear, love so fierce it hurt. As I listened, I realized how many people were carrying moments like mine, moments when a single decision changed everything, for better or worse. One afternoon, a woman asked me what moment defined my life. The room went still, all eyes on me. For a second, I thought of saying something safe, raising Mateo, leaving his father, starting over. But the truth rose up before I could stop it. I told them about the plane, about the crying baby, the armed men, the way fear pressed against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them open, about standing up anyway, hands shaking, heart racing, choosing to help even though every instinct screamed not to. When I finished, there was silence, not awkward, reverent. One woman wiped her eyes. Another nodded slowly, like something had settled into place for her. "That," she said softly, "is what courage really is." I walked home that evening with a strange lightness in my chest. Not pride, clarity. Understanding that our lives aren't defined by the titles we carry, mother, worker, survivor, but by the moments when we choose who we want to be. Mateo called later that night. He'd been accepted into a mentoring program for young men growing up without fathers. He said he wanted to give back what he'd been given: stability, presence, love without conditions. He said he learned it from you, like it was obvious. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the quiet. Tears slipped down my face, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that everything I'd endured had become something useful, that pain, when carried with care, can turn into purpose. Years passed gently after that. My hair went silver, my hands grew slower, but my heart stayed open. I kept the music box, though I played it less often. Its melody lived inside me now. On my 70th birthday, Mateo gave me a small, carefully wrapped gift. Inside was a new music box, handcrafted, simple, beautiful. When I turned the key, the tune was different, but the feeling was the same. "For all the times you soothed me, even when I didn't know I needed it," he said. I understood then that the comfort we give doesn't disappear. It echoes. It returns in new forms at unexpected times, carried by the people we've loved into who they become. As I write this now, the world feels loud, uncertain, often unkind. But I also know this: kindness still moves quietly through it, changing lives in ways we may never witness. That night on the plane taught me something I hold close every day. You don't have to be powerful to matter. You don't have to be fearless to be brave. Sometimes the most unthinkable thing you can do is simply reach out, trust your humanity, and offer comfort where it's needed. And sometimes that is enough to change everything.